What happens when a black doctor breaks hospital rules to save a dying stranger, only to be fired, humiliated, and nearly erased by the very system she served. Dr. Nia Holloway, 42, made one decision that exposed decades of racial bias, profit-driven care, and institutional silence. But this time, the punishment backfired. Her story didn't just go viral. It sparked a movement that's rewriting healthcare across America. And it all began with one undocumented patient and a heartbeat. The morning air was still heavy with fog when 42-year-old Dr. Nia Holloway stepped into the lobby of St. Victor Medical Center. Her steps were measured, steady, but her pulse betrayed her. She'd been summoned urgently after working a double shift the night before. Her uniform was spotless, her back straight, but she knew something wasn't right. She didn't expect the crowd, patients, nurses, receptionists, all standing still, eyes glued to the far end of the hall, waiting. Nia Holloway. A voice rang out from the upper mezzanine. It belonged to Chief Administrator Brent Halvorsen, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and political connections, not his compassion. His voice was tight with forced control. You are hereby terminated from your duties, effective immediately. Please leave your credentials and security badge at the front desk. Murmurs swept through the hall like a wind through tall grass. No warning, no private meeting, just a public shaming. Nia remained silent as she stepped forward, removed her identification badge, and placed it neatly on the polished granite counter. No one moved to help her, not even the nursing assistants she'd trained herself. Halvorsen's voice cut through the silence again, this time colder. You violated triage protocol. You used equipment without approval. You administered care without verifying insurance status. You made a unilateral decision that could have cost this hospital its legal standing. But Nia had made a different calculation. A life or death one. Hours earlier, at the end of a 14-hour trauma shift, she had heard a crash outside the ER entrance. A man, bloodied, confused, barely conscious, had stumbled through the sliding doors. No ID, no wallet, no indication of coverage. Just one thing, a collapsed lung and an unstable airway. The front desk clerk hadn't even stood up. No insurance, no treatment, she muttered while tapping on her phone. Nia didn't ask for permission. She asked for a crash cart. She acted. She saved him. But in the cold arithmetic of St. Victor's balance sheets, saving an unidentified man with no financial footprint was a reckless indulgence, not a miracle, not a duty, just a liability. As she walked out of the hospital for what she thought would be the last time, she noticed something strange. The bench across the street, normally occupied by a mentally ill veteran named Junior, was taken by someone else. A man in an impeccably tailored overcoat, holding a phone with a polished steel edge. He looked out of place, intentional. What Nia didn't know was that the man she had saved wore a rare titanium medical alert tag under his torn shirt, a detail unnoticed during emergency triage. That tag belonged to Mason King, CEO of Kingwell Group, a private equity firm that had recently acquired interests in several major healthcare conglomerates. His estimated worth, $2.8 billion. Back inside, Halvorsen turned to the silent crowd with an air of finality. Let this be an example. Protocols are not optional, even when emotions run high. The weight of his words rippled through the staff, through clerks, nurses, and physicians who had quietly watched the hospital grow more corporate, less human. But no one spoke up. Not yet. What no one at St. Victor knew, what even Nia herself didn't yet realize, was that this wasn't the end of her story. It was the moment the system picked the wrong person to humiliate. The wind picked up as Dr. Nia Holloway stepped onto the curb, her breath visible in the chilly morning air. She looked down at her phone. 3 missed calls, all from an unrecognized number. By the time the 4th came in, she was halfway through unlocking her apartment door. "Dr. Holloway?" The voice was measured, polite, but carried the unmistakable tone of urgency. "My name is Andre Voss, legal representative for Kingwell Group. I'd like to speak with you immediately regarding the man you treated last night." Nia stopped in her tracks. If this is about a malpractice claim, it's not. It's quite the opposite. Within the hour, they met at a corner table in a quiet downtown cafe. The contrast between Nia's modest hoodie and Voss's tailored charcoal suit could not have been starker. Yet he addressed her with unmistakable respect. "The man you saved," he began, sliding a sleek tablet across the table, "is Mason King, founder and CEO of Kingwell Group. You may not have recognized him covered in blood and dirt. He had a solo hiking accident, fell into a ravine, and barely crawled to your hospital." The image on the tablet was unmistakable. It was the same man whose airway she'd cleared, and whose bleeding she'd stemmed with pressure bandages from a barely stocked trauma cart. Now he was dressed in an impeccable tuxedo, smiling for the cover of Forbes Health Tech. Nia leaned back, stunned. "And how is he?" she asked. "Alive because of you," Voss replied, and furious, Nia's brow furrowed. "Not at you, at the hospital, at what he heard, at how he was nearly refused treatment because he couldn't prove he had insurance." The moment landed like a stone in her gut. She had grown numb to the institution's indifference, but hearing it described by someone on the outside made it feel real in a new way. Back at St. Victor Medical Center, Halverson was busy crafting the official story. Staff misconduct, unauthorized intervention, disregard for protocol. The boardrooms echoed with sterile words that buried the truth. What Halverson didn't know was that Mason King wasn't just a patient. He was a strategist, and he was already coordinating a comprehensive internal probe, one that included subpoenaed emails, facility audio logs, and testimonies from whistleblowers. He had also personally requested Dr. Holloway's contact. "You didn't ask who he was," Voss said. "You didn't stop to check credit. You saved a life. That's the kind of physician King believes the system should protect, not punish." It was the first time in days that Nia felt seen, not as a liability, but as a leader. Over the next week, Kingwell Group mobilized a task force. Not a public lawsuit yet, but something far more potent. A shadow audit of St. Victor's financial, ethical, and medical history. Behind closed doors, an avalanche of data emerged. Records showed that 92% of uninsured patients turned away over the past 3 years were either Black or Latino. Dozens of internal memos referenced resource prioritization tied to patients' zip codes, many of which mapped directly to low-income communities of color. Some patients had been rerouted to urgent care centers that had no surgical capability. More chilling were the audio logs. One recorded Halvorsen saying, "She broke the chain of command." These activist types always think they're untouchable. She gave care to a vagrant. If we let that slide, what's next? To Nia, the comments weren't shocking. They were familiar. But for the lawyers and investigators listening in for the first time, it painted a damning picture. Publicly, things remained quiet. Privately, the fuse had been lit. Meanwhile, Nia returned to her riverside apartment, where the rent was due and her bank account had fewer digits than ever before. She began receiving hateful messages from anonymous hospital staff, comments calling her reckless, impulsive, unprofessional. Screenshots surfaced online, taken from security footage of her mid-procedure, used as propaganda to shame her. But not all messages were hostile. A nurse from another hospital in the city sent a private message. "You saved that man. Everyone knows it. Thank you." Then a package arrived. No return label. Inside was a small engraved plaque. It read, "The only wrong move was doing nothing. MK." It was a quiet gesture, but one that reignited something in her. Soon, Voss reached out again. "Mason wants to meet you, in person. He's still recovering in a private suite at Ridgepoint Clinic." That meeting would mark a shift neither of them fully anticipated. King, now conscious and walking with assistance, greeted her with a firm handshake. "You saw past my appearance. You didn't flinch. That says everything I need to know about you, and about that hospital." Nia didn't know how to respond. Most people see value in power. You saw value in life. What followed was a candid hour-long conversation about everything from staffing ratios to implicit bias in hospital policy. King wasn't a saint. He admitted his companies had participated in acquisitions that sometimes hurt small community clinics. But his accident had shifted his priorities. He wanted to be a part of something that restored trust in healthcare, not eroded it. His next move was decisive. He bought out a controlling stake in St. Victor Medical Center through a shell company within 2 weeks. Quiet, legal, complete. He didn't announce the change of ownership immediately. Instead, he began replacing mid-level administrators. He hired a civil rights audit firm, and he put Dr. Nia Holloway on retainer. "You're not just a doctor," he told her. "You're the conscience of that building." What King also understood, and what made the strategy go viral, was narrative power. He authorized a leak of footage showing Nia's firing and paired it with an anonymous blog post titled "The Doctor Who Saved Me While Our Hospital Watched." Within hours, Reddit threads exploded. TikTok edits set her silent walk down the hallway to powerful orchestral music. Twitter X reposted it with captions like, "This is what integrity looks like." Honor Dr. Holloway trended for 3 days straight. Media requests flooded her inbox. But Nia remained mostly silent, by choice, because this wasn't about one interview. It was about building something that would last longer than any hashtag, and she wasn't alone anymore. For 2 days, Dr. Nia Holloway kept her head low. She didn't answer media calls. She didn't respond to the praise or hate flooding her inbox. She spent her mornings reading medical journals and her evenings walking the same neighborhood blocks she'd grown up on. Every headline called her a hero. But in her own mind, she was just a woman who did what anyone should have done and got punished for it. Meanwhile, several stories were unfolding behind closed doors. Mason King hadn't stopped with legal strategy. He launched a full-scale internal investigation under a shell firm, Sable Analytics, using private investigators, compliance auditors, and 2 retired federal agents. Their first move, requesting all recorded hospital security footage from the week of the incident. Their second, initiating confidential interviews with nurses orderlies, and administrative assistants willing to talk, off the record. Patterns emerged fast. The hospital's own triage data, poorly secured and dated by system timestamps, showed a disproportionate trend. Over the past 18 months, uninsured patients who identified as Black or Latino were nearly 4 times more likely to be marked non-urgent or referral only, even when presenting with chest pain, severe wounds, or head trauma. Internal memos used coded language like non-revenue criticals and repeat liabilities. It was textbook profiling, automated, normalized, and invisible until someone traced the breadcrumbs. One night, Nia received a message from Naomi Caldwell, a data analyst who used to work in IT support for St. Victor before being laid off during budget reallocation. Naomi still had archived logs from an older server the hospital had tried to decommission quietly. She emailed one encrypted file, risk adjustments, Q4-unfiltered.csv. The document listed patient names, insurance codes, race, treatment level, and cost assessments. It also flagged exceptions, patients who received full treatment, despite being coded as financial risks. Nia's name appeared repeatedly in the exceptions column. "I think they were building a case against you long before last week," Naomi wrote. "You didn't just break protocol, you broke the algorithm." In one tab, someone had manually typed the phrase, "Holloway oversteps again. Excessive altruism pattern." The phrase stuck in Nia's mind for days. Excessive altruism. It was the kind of phrase that made compassion sound like a disease. As Mason's team dug deeper, it became clear the hospital's discriminatory behavior wasn't just passive. It was intentional, strategic, profitable. Public records showed that campaign donations totaling over $1.2 million had been routed from entities tied to the hospital board directly to Mayor Sylvester Crane's re-election campaign. Crane, the cousin of hospital director Brent Halvorsen, had quietly pushed for a zoning exemption that allowed St. Victor to expand its urgent care facility into a tax shelter. The timeline was damning. The expansion occurred the same month the hospital began outsourcing ER triage to a third-party contractor specializing in cost-to-care optimization. That contractor, also partially owned by Kingwell Group and prior to Mason's full buyout. "You were saving lives," Voss told Nia one evening. "They were running spreadsheets." Still, they needed a catalyst, something undeniable, visual, and capable of igniting public outrage without sacrificing legal standing. That moment came from Terry Adams, a soft-spoken radiology tech who had worked nights for over a decade. He delivered a 12-minute clip recorded from a forgotten ceiling mic in the admin wing. In it, Halvorsen is heard in a budget meeting. "She's too idealistic. That kind of moral grandstanding doesn't keep the lights on. You want to save lives, volunteer at a clinic. We're here to protect the brand." The investigators barely needed to edit the audio. It spoke for itself. It wasn't long before the story shifted from quiet inquiry to organized reckoning. King authorized a tactical media campaign. A leaked video, carefully edited, showed snippets of Nia's public dismissal, internal memos about excessive altruism, and audio of Halvorsen. It was published anonymously on a new platform called Healthcare Leaks. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. The New York Sentinel ran a Sunday headline in bold black font, "Profit over patients, inside America's newest healthcare scandal." The National Board of Medical Ethics released a statement within 12 hours calling the case an egregious example of systemic failure at both the administrative and policy level. The Office of the Inspector General opened a federal audit into the city's healthcare funding. And St. Victor? It had gone dark. The website taken offline. Phones rang unanswered. Even the hospital's official social media pages were deactivated. But the most significant shift happened quietly, at ground level. Across the country, Black and Latino patients shared stories online about being turned away, redirected, or shamed for their inability to pay. A viral TikTok showed a collage of hospital bills totaling over $90,000 for a single birth, complicated by preeclampsia, posted with the caption, "Would Nia Holloway have let me die?" Healthcare professionals began speaking up. Former nurses, EMTs, residents, all echoing the same sentiment. Compassion had become a liability in the modern hospital. Even within the American Medical Association, internal groups began drafting memos demanding stronger whistleblower protections and mandatory bias training in triage systems. Meanwhile, Brent Halvorson's world shrank by the hour. The hospital board voted in an emergency meeting to suspend him. A growing list of class action lawsuits had begun stacking up on his desk, alleging fraud, patient discrimination, and retaliatory terminations. His cousin, Mayor Sylvester Crane, held a press conference denying any knowledge of improper campaign funding, but reporters weren't buying it. The IRS and state attorney's office had launched separate inquiries. A subpoena was issued for donation records, a second for Halvorson's personal financial disclosures. But the real nail in the coffin came from an unlikely source. Marcus Ellis, the hospital's former chief financial officer, appeared on a national news show just 2 days after the gala broadcast. "I kept quiet because I had kids in college," Ellis confessed, "but I helped hide the numbers. I signed off on it. We optimized treatment decisions based on reimbursement probability. I didn't blow the whistle. Nia did." In response, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced the Holloway Amendment, a proposed addition to EMTALA aimed at strengthening protections for healthcare professionals who provide emergency treatment, regardless of insurance status. The bill wasn't perfect, but the name alone signaled a shift. Back at her apartment, Nia sat by her window, watching protesters gather outside the shuttered hospital entrance. Some carried signs that read, "Every patient matters." Others simply held up photos of family members lost to delayed care. It wasn't just about her anymore. A movement had begun. Mason King visited her 2 days after the gala. No bodyguards, no assistants, just him and a folder. "I want you to see this," he said, laying down a blueprint for what looked like a complete overhaul of St. Victor Medical Center. New leadership, new protocols, a dedicated equity review board, and a public-facing care audit updated monthly. "I want you to lead it." Nia didn't respond immediately. She needed time to process, to grieve, to breathe. But she already knew her answer. In the following weeks, she began assembling her team. Naomi Caldwell returned to head data integrity. Dr. Malcolm Torres, a young Afro-Latino physician known for his community advocacy, was recruited to lead emergency services. Nurses who had previously resigned or been pushed out quietly reapplied. Some were rehired within days. They didn't want perfection. They wanted a chance to heal something broken. On April 28th, St. Victor reopened its ER under a new banner, the Holloway Community Health Initiative. No one was turned away. Insurance status was noted for administrative purposes, but never used to determine care. On its first day, over 400 people showed up, some for treatment, some just to witness it with their own eyes. Cable news vans circled the block. Patients cried in the waiting room, not out of pain, but disbelief. Inside, a new staff orientation began with a simple pledge: we treat people, not profits. Meanwhile, Brent Halvorsen, once the face of streamlined healthcare administration, was indicted on 14 counts, including wire fraud, discrimination, and misappropriation of public funds. His trial date was set for the following spring. His lawyer released a statement calling the charges politically motivated, but the court of public opinion had long since rendered its verdict. In one final blow to his legacy, Halvorsen's name was removed from the wing he had funded. A digital plaque replaced it with the words, "In honor of every patient ever denied, you deserved better." For Nia, the fame was overwhelming. She declined interviews, refused book deals, politely turned down documentary crews. When asked why, she said the same thing every time. This was never about spotlight. It was about course correction. And slowly, steadily, that correction spread. Hospitals in 3 other states began adopting protocols based on the Holloway Initiative model. Health insurance providers released new equity-based audits in response to public pressure. Medical schools updated ethics curricula with case studies inspired by her story. In classrooms, students now studied compassion not as a liability, but as a leadership trait. And while Nia still walked the same streets of her childhood neighborhood, strangers now greeted her not with pity or praise, but gratitude. Not because she exposed a broken system, but because she proved it could be rebuilt. 8 months after her firing, Dr. Nia Holloway stood inside a building she once thought she'd never enter again. But it wasn't the same place. Not anymore. Gone were the sterile white walls and locked access doors that had once kept community patients and lower-ranking staff at a distance. In their place, murals of local artists, bilingual signs, and hallways filled with natural light instead of fluorescent glare. The hospital had been renamed the Holloway Health Collective, a name chosen not by Mason King or the board, but by a vote held among 12 surrounding neighborhoods. For the first time, the hospital belonged to the people it served. The transformation wasn't just aesthetic. It was infrastructural, philosophical, human. One of the first changes Nia implemented was the elimination of profit-weighted triage. Every incoming patient was now evaluated based on clinical urgency, not financial coding. Insurance verification was conducted privately, never in front of other patients, and patients unable to pay, they received the same care as everyone else. No questions, no shaming. It wasn't just compassionate, it was legal. The Holloway Health Collective had established a dedicated compliance team to monitor and report treatment disparities, making sure the mistakes of the past would never become habits again. Behind the scenes, Nia had pushed for something even more radical. A community review council. This council, made up of patients, advocates, and former critics of the hospital, met every month to review anonymized case studies, triage outcomes, and access statistics. Their findings were posted publicly. Accountability wasn't a slogan. It was policy. When asked about the model, Nia would often say, healthcare shouldn't just be about curing illness. It should be about building trust. National media quickly took notice. NPR called the model a case study in post-crisis reinvention. Modern Hospital magazine featured the Holloway Collective as their Innovation of the Year. But the real validation didn't come from headlines. It came from the people. One Tuesday morning, an older woman in a church hat walked in clutching her granddaughter's hand. She looked around, then asked the receptionist softly, "Is this the place where they treat you like a person?" The receptionist smiled and nodded. "Yes, ma'am, you're in the right place." Word spread faster than anyone predicted. By winter, the collective was seeing more than 900 patients a week, nearly double the previous volume. Wait lists grew, but so did staffing. Nurses who had fled the industry came back. Retired clinicians asked to volunteer. Third-year med students from state universities applied for new equity-focused clinical rotations. Some flew in from out of state. Meanwhile, the hospital's culture shifted at every level. Staff began each shift with a 3-minute community huddle, not just to review procedures, but to check in emotionally. Burnout rates dropped. Patient satisfaction rose. But the most startling data came from the new feedback system. 89% of patients said they felt respected, regardless of income, race, or immigration status. That kind of trust wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary. Behind the scenes, Naomi Caldwell, now head of ethical data science, overhauled the hospital's outdated algorithms. The same system that once flagged poor patients as liabilities was now re-engineered to identify access barriers and prioritize follow-ups for underrepresented groups. Naomi even partnered with developers to create an open-source tool that other hospitals could implement. That project, named Pulse Equity, was downloaded more than 14,000 times within its first month. Still, Nia knew the hospital's rebirth alone wouldn't fix the national crisis. So she started building bridges. She gave talks, not to celebrate herself, but to challenge the system. At a health equity summit in Boston, she posed a question that made headlines. What would happen if compassion wasn't punished, but funded? That quote ended up on posters, T-shirts, and eventually a billboard outside the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. In response to the growing visibility, several state legislatures proposed versions of the Holloway Standard, a framework for hospital compliance metrics based on non-discrimination, community involvement, and transparent billing practices. The Department of Health even launched an exploratory task force to consider including these metrics in national accreditation reviews. 1 year after her termination, Nia Holloway was no longer just a doctor. She was a movement. But it wasn't without cost. The backlash came in waves. Conservative commentators accused her of radicalizing health care. One op-ed accused the collective of putting feelings above efficiency. An anonymous whistleblower filed a complaint, claiming the hospital was giving preferential treatment to minority patients. None of it stuck. Every audit passed. Every data point upheld the hospital's fairness. Still, Nia never lost sight of the personal stakes. One night, she walked through the ER waiting area and spotted a janitor named Elijah, an older man with kind eyes who had worked at the hospital for nearly 2 decades. He nodded as she passed. "You know, Dr. Holloway," he said, "I used to clean these floors wondering if anyone would ever care about folks like me. Now I mop 'em, knowing they finally do." She nodded back, her throat tightening. That, she thought, was the real metric. Meanwhile, Mason King, still recovering from his accident, stepped back from full-time operations at Kingwell Group. He devoted much of his time to launching a philanthropic foundation focused on healthcare equity. The first grant, $100 million earmarked for replicating the Holloway model in 5 additional cities, with priority given to historically underserved areas: Atlanta, Detroit, El Paso, Jackson, Oakland. Each site had different demographics, but one thing in common: they'd all been deemed unprofitable by mainstream healthcare systems. Now they had a new blueprint. Each new site adopted 3 key principles. 1. Universal emergency care. No patient denied based on status, coverage, or appearance. 2. Community-guided operations. Monthly reviews by local citizens to track transparency. 3. Ethical technology integration. AI systems monitored and adjusted for racial or income bias. To ensure integrity, every grant came with a stipulation: at least 25% of each clinic's board had to be made up of patients or frontline workers. The momentum was impossible to ignore. Even corporate hospitals, initially dismissive, began piloting small-scale reforms. One major insurer agreed to stop tying hospital performance bonuses to patient collection rates. Another dropped its lawsuit against a nonprofit hospital accused of providing excessive charity care. Nia watched it all unfold quietly, not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as a witness to what could happen when one act of compassion collided with a system that desperately needed disruption. Her impact wasn't measured in headlines. It was measured in breaths saved, families protected, trust rebuilt. And still, she never called it a revolution. She called it a repair. You can't replace a broken heart with a stronger machine. She once told a group of student nurses, "You mend it with purpose and people." At the collective's 1-year celebration, a surprise announcement was made. Mason King took the stage with a check for another $50 million, not for construction, not for expansion, but for a new school, the Holloway School of Ethical Medicine, a tuition-free institution for Black, Latino, Indigenous, and first-generation students dedicated to practicing medicine with empathy, equity, and excellence. When the crowd erupted in applause, Nia didn't take the mic. She stood back, watching her team, Naomi, Dr. Torres, the nurses, the janitors, celebrate what they had built together. Because that was the transformation, not just of a hospital, but of a system that had once made people like her invisible. Now she was unavoidable, and not because she fought for revenge, but because she built something no one could ignore. The sky over Atlanta was a muted gray the morning doctor. Nia Holloway stepped onto the stage at the grand opening of the 5th Holloway Health Collective site. The crowd gathered outside the former Ridgefield General Hospital, now rebranded with glass front doors, multilingual signage, and a mural of hands reaching across a heartbeat line, reflected something deeper than ceremony. It reflected transformation. Hundreds filled the block: local church groups, medical students, policymakers. Some stood silently with signs that read, "We were turned away here." Others simply held photos, loved ones who had died waiting for care. Nia took the mic with a presence that no longer trembled under scrutiny. Her voice, shaped by fire and purpose, cut clean through the air. "We were never supposed to survive this system," she said, "and yet we did more than survive. We redesigned it." Applause, a few tears, cameras flashing, but she didn't pause for effect. This building once stood as a monument to selective healing. Today, it becomes a sanctuary for unconditional care. The words weren't just poetic. They marked the culmination of a year's worth of justice, grit, and tireless collaboration. Following the first Holloway Health Collective's viral rise and successful reforms, Communities around the country had reached out for guidance. The foundation created by Mason King, now chaired by a mix of healthcare professionals, activists, and patients, began fielding requests. Cities with histories of medical redlining and care deserts were prioritized. Atlanta was chosen for a reason. The city's black maternal mortality rate was nearly 3 times the national average. And this building? It had once turned away a pregnant woman during active labor because her ID had expired. The message was clear. This wasn't just expansion, it was reclamation. Across the country, the movement had ignited something that even the most well-funded lobbyists couldn't control: public expectation. The term Holloway compliance had entered policy discussions. Major health systems, once hostile to reform, began offering transparency dashboards and updating bias training protocols. Some did it voluntarily, others under pressure from local governments influenced by rising constituents who'd watched Nia's story unfold like a living blueprint. Medical schools began revising entrance essay prompts. One school asked applicants, "What does it mean to treat someone with dignity when the system says they don't matter?" The essay quickly gained traction on social media as the Holloway question. Even pop culture couldn't resist the pull. An independent filmmaker released Code Red, The Holloway Principle, a dramatized account of the events at St. Victor. Nia allowed it, under one condition: that the final scene focus not on her, but on the patients who'd been denied. The film won awards not because it was sensational, but because it forced its viewers to feel what it meant to be invisible in a place designed to heal. Yet not all the visibility was comfortable. At a town hall in Chicago, a protester interrupted her talk, shouting, "You're just a mascot for guilt." Security approached, but Nia raised a hand. "I understand that anger," she said calmly, "because it used to live in me too. But I'm not here to be your symbol. I'm here to make sure no one else becomes your statistic." The audience fell silent. Then, applause. Redemption had never been Nia's goal. Accountability was. But legacy, that was something she could no longer ignore. Months later, she was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on health care equity. She didn't bring a slideshow, no handouts, just her story and the data Naomi and her team had collected, showing measurable declines in patient rejection rates, ER wait time disparities, and racial gaps in pain management decisions across collective sites. A representative from Texas asked, "Dr. Holloway, what would it cost to implement this model nationwide?" She responded without hesitation, "Less than what we already pay for lawsuits, redundant billing, and the moral erosion of every nurse who wants to help, but is told to wait for a billing code first." The room was quiet for a long time. Eventually, the panel passed a bipartisan recommendation to pilot Holloway-modeled reforms in 12 public hospitals across 5 states. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the start of one. Meanwhile, back in her own collective, things kept evolving. A young woman named Lena Bryant, a third-year med student from North Carolina, completed her clinical rotation under Dr. Malcolm Torres. She'd lost her mother at a for-profit hospital after being misdiagnosed during a 10-minute consult. Her goal? To never let rushed care be the norm. She later became the first graduate of the Holloway School of Ethical Medicine. On her graduation day, Lena read a quote from the plaque outside the school entrance. "In this building, excellence is measured in empathy, not efficiency." That quote had been written by Nia herself, scribbled on a sticky note late one night after a particularly difficult case involving a homeless teen with untreated diabetes. Sometimes the paperwork felt endless, the pressure unbearable. But moments like Lena's graduation reminded her why the battle mattered. As for Brent Halvorsen, he was convicted on multiple charges, including discriminatory practices and embezzlement. The courtroom remained mostly empty during his sentencing, except for one face in the back row. Elijah, the janitor from the old St. Victor days, had traveled 5 hours just to watch. He never said a word. He didn't need to. That night, Nia received a single text from Elijah. "Justice, like floors, needs sweeping. Thanks for picking up the broom." Mason King, now mostly retired, stayed in touch. Occasionally, he'd send encrypted memos suggesting partnerships or research funding opportunities. But more often he just sent updates about his health and gratitude. "I used to think I built companies," he once wrote. "But watching you, I realize I was just laying the foundation for what comes next." In her free time, rare as it was, Nia had started mentoring underrepresented students interested in medicine. Not for resume polishing, not for applications, just to remind them that they belonged, that their compassion wasn't a liability, but a superpower. At the 2-year anniversary of the first collective's rebirth, a mural was unveiled in the hospital courtyard. It depicted patients and providers, arms linked, walking together through double doors into a hospital made of glass, roots, and sun. No white coats, no stethoscopes, just people, equal. The inscription read, "We do not fix broken systems. We replace them with better ones." And under it, "In honor of every life once turned away." Nia stood beside her mother, who wiped tears with a handkerchief stitched with the words, "She did it." The ceremony was brief, intentional, because work remained. That afternoon, Nia returned to her office, now located in a shared space with nursing leadership. No corner suite, no private lounge. She reviewed patient feedback reports, signed off on a new prenatal outreach initiative in partnership with a local community center, answered emails from colleagues in Detroit asking for help replicating their tech dashboard. Then she looked out the window. On the sidewalk outside, 2 kids were racing bikes. One wore a hoodie with the words, "Trust your doctor, not their billing code," across the back. Nia smiled. The system hadn't just been reformed, it had been rewritten, and the pen, as it turned out, had always been in her hand. There are moments in history when everything slows down, when noise fades, and the only thing left is clarity. For Dr. Nia Holloway, that moment didn't come during the courtroom conviction. It didn't arrive with legislation passed in her name, or with her photo on a magazine cover. It came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, in a modest examination room in East Oakland. She was listening to the heartbeat of a 5-year-old boy whose mother had driven 3 hours just to see her. "You're the one who didn't let that man die," the mother whispered. "I figured if you'd help a stranger, maybe you'd help us." Nia just nodded and said, "I've got him now." No media, no crowd, no viral moment, just the rhythm of a child's heart in a space that once would have turned him away. It was that simplicity, the quiet persistence of doing what's right, that defined Nia's legacy, not as a hero of headlines, but as an architect of something much harder, a compassionate future. The Holloway Health Collectives were no longer pilot projects. They had become case studies in sustainable reform. A recent report from the National Health Equity Council showed that ER bounce-back rates had dropped by 47% in communities served by the collectives. Preventive care appointments increased by over 60%. And perhaps most remarkably, patient trust in medical staff, once the lowest metric in underserved communities, had climbed above 80% for the first time in 2 decades. That wasn't just data. That was dignity measured. Legislation continued to echo her influence. California, Illinois, and New York passed new hospital accountability laws that required equity audits, bias screening and AI diagnostics, and the right of patients to appeal non-treatment decisions before administrative review. Even private insurers, long resistant to change, had begun piloting care equity incentives, financial rewards for hospitals that demonstrated closing disparity gaps in treatment outcomes. And yet, Nia never stopped asking questions. How do we ensure the reforms aren't performative? How do we protect young doctors who want to speak up? How do we stop a new generation of Halvorsens from hiding behind data and policy? Because Nia knew what few dared say aloud. Systems don't collapse. They adapt. And so, change had to evolve too. Smarter, louder, more rooted in community than ever before. In late spring, the first graduating class of the Holloway School of Ethical Medicine crossed the stage. The valedictorian, Adrian Keene, a soft-spoken Afro-Indigenous student from Tulsa, ended his speech not with accolades, but a promise. We are not entering a system. We are remaking it, room by room, rule by rule, heartbeat by heartbeat. That line became a chant, a pledge, and soon after, a movement of its own. Meanwhile, Nia's own life remained remarkably ordinary. She walked to work. She rotated through night shifts. She returned texts from mentees. She mourned the patients she couldn't save. She celebrated the ones who got a second chance. She did not become a senator, or a talk show regular, or a best-selling author. She stayed a doctor, but her influence couldn't be contained by titles. It seeped into institutions. It rewrote policies. It cracked open conversations that had long been dismissed as too radical or too emotional. Medical conferences began adding full-day tracks on ethical resistance in practice. Student unions lobbied for patient rights to be part of required coursework. And on college campuses from Oregon to Florida, students hosted Holloway forums, public events inviting communities to critique local hospitals without fear of legal retaliation. The greatest impact, however, came from outside the spotlight. One by one, old barriers began to fall. A group of black doulas in Louisiana secured funding to integrate with local clinics, citing Holloway data in their grant proposals. A refugee health cooperative in Michigan adapted the collective's intake system to remove stigmatizing language around immigration status. A retired surgeon in Phoenix launched a mentorship fund in Nia's name for queer students of color pursuing surgical specialties. Each ripple had its own story. Each story traced back to that single, impossible choice Nia made one night, to break protocol and save a man who no one thought mattered. That man, Mason King, remained a close ally. Though he never returned to full-time business, he worked behind the scenes to fund mobile clinics, legal defense funds for whistleblowers, and tech solutions that exposed algorithmic bias in diagnostic tools. "Your decision didn't just save me," he once told Nia during a rare public event. "It made me worth saving." When asked what she felt most proud of, Nia never mentioned the buildings or the awards or the laws. She always pointed to the scholarship board in the lobby of each collective. A wall of names, black and brown students, first-generation scholars, former patients turned physicians. She called them the long game. In one particularly emotional moment, Nia met Marisol Vega, the younger sister of a woman who had died in the original St. Victor ER after being triaged as non-critical. Marisol had applied to medical school using that tragedy as her fuel. She got in. "I'm not doing this for revenge," Marisol said. "I'm doing it because I want the next girl who walks through those doors to be seen as a person, not a profile." Nia hugged her, holding back tears. That was the power of compassion, not as sentiment, but as strategy, as infrastructure, as justice. It did what no policy memo could. It healed in ways spreadsheets couldn't measure, and it outlived the moment it started in, even in retirement. Whenever that would come, Nia knew the work would continue, because the goal had never been to center herself. The goal was to render cruelty obsolete, to make denying care as unthinkable as refusing water to someone on fire. And in that vision, she found peace. 1 year later, standing before a crowd in Washington, D.C., as she accepted a national award for public service, Nia looked out over the room filled with policymakers, activists, and patients. "I never set out to change health care," she said. "I just refused to ignore a dying man, and the system punished me for it." She paused, let the silence breathe. But the punishment didn't break me. It became my blueprint. And now thousands of people are alive, not because I had power, but because I remembered what we're supposed to do when someone asks for help. The crowd stood in unison. Some cried, some clapped, but most simply listened, because in her voice they didn't hear triumph. They heard truth.